Okay, you might wonder why in a, uh, a lecture on justice and economic history, we start off with a graphic of bees and use the theme music of Rimsky-Korsakov's the Flight of the Bumblebee. Let me suggest that this will become clear um, in a little while. Okay, so on the question of history, the economics profession formally dropped history as a requirement um, for a PhD in economics in 1973. And the idea was that economics was a pure science and didn't need history. After all, you don't need to know anything about Pythagoras to study the Pythagorean theorem. Well, the theory here was you didn't need to understand history to understand the ideas of economics. But this is somewhat of a strange idea because the all uh, of the ideas arise out of a particular historical context. And without understanding that context, we really can't understand the ideas. Okay. All right, so let's start. And we'll start with the ancient world. Now, we'll go back to the Greek polis. We could go back to India or China, but we'll go back to Greece. And then we'll go to the fall of Greece and the rise of Rome and its fall. Okay, so thinking about the Greek polis, what you had were wandering tribes who settled in cities. They were mostly free citizens, and it was the polis that made them free. But they were still tribally based, and this leads to lots of wars. Well, this warrior culture becomes a commercial culture. So kind of commercial war replaces actual war. This leads to debt slavery. So many of the Greeks fall into debt slavery that the whole social order gets weakened and it cannot defend itself. Slaves do not make good soldiers. All right. Then comes the rise of Rome. All right, Rome starts out as refugees from the city of Troy. They are citizen, soldier, farmers, all three in one, and they conquer the world. But there are increasing class divisions. Why? Because while the soldiers were out conquering the world, the aristocratic class was seizing their farms. This leads to 100 years of civil war in Rome. The farmers lost their homes, and then the cost of empire, which originally empire is very profitable, but after a time it reverses and it becomes a drain. Rome solved its domestic problems by establishing a welfare state. But outside of Rome, it was a slave society. And slave societies, once again, cannot defend themselves. So, who do we want to look at here? Of course, we're going to start with Aristotle, as we always do. So, 322 to 384 BC. We're going to talk about a political ethical economy, justice, need or the demand curve, money, natural and unnatural exchange, and usury. Now, the political ethical economy, Aristotle doesn't actually have a work on economics. All his thoughts on economics are contained within the pages of his Nicomachean Ethics and the Politics. The purpose, the economy has a telos, a purpose, and that purpose is provisioning the polis. And for Aristotle, the city should be self-sufficient. It should be able to supply everything it needs internally or from the surrounding countryside. And the whole thing has to be rooted in justice. Now, what does he mean by justice? Economically, it means two kinds: distributive and corrective. Distributive justice, corrective justice. Now, distributive justice deals with the distribution of rewards from a group, state, family, firm, to its members. Okay. It's based on two things: contribution and merit. Now, contribution is arithmetic. So if you contribute 40 hours to production and I contribute 20, you should get twice as much as I do. But the other part is merit. What is the worth of that contribution? Is the contribution of the janitor and the engineer the same contribution? Well, that's a question of merit. This question is cultural. And for Aristotle, this could not be calculated. It's a cultural judgment. So different societies will judge merit in different ways. Corrective justice is based on equal values. You can call it arithmetic justice. And it deals with justice in exchanges. So here's the model. There's a group that makes distributions to individuals. So in a company, we would say these are wages, profits, payments for raw materials, etc. This is based on contribution and merit. That's distributive justice. Now, the individuals exchange among themselves. Okay, this is corrective, and later it was called commutative justice. Well, corrective justice requires equal values, but how do you equate dissimilar things, say shoes and houses? How many pairs of shoes are equal to one house? Well, for Aristotle, this would be based on need measured in terms of money. So money for Aristotle was a social convention used to measure need. Let's examine that a little further. Aristotle traces the name of money to law. So numisma, he says, comes from nomos, which is law. This means that money is not something natural. That is something that is created by government. So it's a convenience for exchange, not a natural commodity. And he says, the state can change the value of money if the public good requires it. Now this will figure into later battles over money between goldbacks, greenbacks, credit theories of money, etc., etc. We will deal with those at a later date. Here's another idea about natural and unnatural exchange. Natural exchange. This is providing goods for the family. Unnatural exchange aims purely at making money. What does he mean by natural and unnatural? Well, to the Greeks, the natural, things that were natural had a limit, whereas things that were unnatural were unlimited. Okay. So think about buying bread for the family versus trying to corner the market in bread. I mean, if you're buying bread for the family, you're not going to buy up every loaf in the store. But if you are trying to control the market for bread, well, that's different. You might indeed try to buy up all the wheat supplies or control the distribution channels, etc. That's unnatural exchange. And he talks about usury. Now, usury was the bane of the ancient world. Why? Because, as we'll see, finance is intrinsic to all economic systems. For Aristotle, usury meant taking interest on a non-productive loan. Money, he thought, should get value only from use. So in this case, from investment. And with investment, if there's no profit, there's no payment. So interest should only be paid from profits, should only be a share in the profits. Pure interest represents wealth without work. Now, usury is a very difficult subject, and we will go into the question of usury later in this course. All right, let's jump ahead to the Middle Ages. All right, we'll talk about the barbarian invasions, their conversion, the idea of justice in the Middle Ages, and the revival of culture. Right. So between the 300s and the 700s, the German tribes were moving across the Rhine River and occupying Roman territories. These were kind of armed migrations. And they were led by warlords who, you can think of them just as thugs. There was a loss of urban life, a loss of law, order. And this was then followed by a loss of North Africa and the Near East to the Arabs. Now, Christianity was actually more centered in the East than in the West. So it was centered around Greece, around Babylon, around Damascus, around Alexandria in Egypt. All of these centers of Christianity were lost to the Muslims. And so between the years 500 and 800, you can have what can reasonably be called a dark age. But the tribes slowly converted to Christianity, and Christian notions of law and life gradually replaced German and even Roman notions. You had a revival of government. So with Charlemagne in France in the 8th century, and Alfred the Great in Germany in the 9th century, Alfred the Great in England in the 9th century, and Otto the Great in Germany in the 10th century. So there was this revival of culture, and this revival was led by the monasteries. They've served as a template not just for learning, but for management and advanced production techniques. This was also a marvelous age of machinery. And there was an agricultural revolution. So there was a whole lot of inventions. The moldboard plow, the spiked harrow, the use of horse collars, which made horses useful for plowing. There was 3-crop rotation, the use of legumes to restore the fertility of the soil. All of these things made farming very, very profitable. And with that, there came a revival of trade and great, great wealth. Now, I think most of you have been to Europe, and you've seen the evidence of this great wealth in the cathedrals and the castles. These projects all absorbed the excess wealth and kept it circulating through society. Well, economics at that time was still controlled by Aristotelian economic thought. And justice at this time was expressed as a set of mutual obligations. So the lords had obligations to their tenants, the tenants had obligations to the Lord and to the church. So this idea of mutuality was written into the economic, social, and political systems. Now, they used the guild system to regulate production and prices. So the guilds were collections of people who practiced the same trade. They established rules for that trade, they established quality standards, and they set prices. At the same time, the serfs, so after the fall of the Roman Empire, most men fell into serfdom, which is simply, serf is simply the Latin word for slave. But the serfs gradually were achieving their freedom and were on their way to becoming peasants or even free men. One of the reasons for this was that the rents that these serfs paid were customary, not economic rents. Now, the meaning of this may not be obvious now, but when we get to looking at property and the law of rents, you'll have a better idea of what that means. Okay, so who are we going to look at here? Oh, St. Thomas Aquinas, what a surprise. All right, 13th century. We'll look at just price theory, the rejection of utility pricing, refinements to the usury theory, and then how the system worked in practice. So just price. The idea here is that price should be sufficient to cover the cost of production plus the labor of the producer and the merchant. But how much should labor be paid? Well, the theory here was stations in life. There were different stations in life. They were all entitled to a dignified existence, but at different levels of dignity. So the laborer lived at one level of dignity, the merchant at another, the prince at another, etc. In modern parlance, this would be a labor theory of value or a cost of production theory. Well, why didn't they use supply and demand like we do, or utility pricing? They thoroughly understood modern utility theories. It wasn't that they didn't know about them, but they rejected them. Why? Because under the moral code, utility is something that exists in the buyer, not in the seller. So in selling utility, the seller sells that which he does not own. So it was rejected as a violation of the seventh commandment. There was a preference then for legal prices. Now, Thomas made many refinements to the usury theory. So interest is justified as participation in profit. Okay? But it could never exceed the normal rate of profit. So if, generally profits from business were 6%, then the interest could never exceed 6%. Okay? But there could be other additions to the interest rate. So compensation for what Thomas called the externalities of money, loss of use, insurance against defaults, as a certain number of the loans are, of course, going to default, the costs of making and servicing the loan, etc. So this involves a movement towards modern banking. All right, the system in practice. They tended to have a free market in natural produce while controlling for the rate of interest and labor. They relied on guilds, on law, and on custom to control prices. And here's the key point. Rents were customary rather than economic. Okay, again, you'll understand that later. It may not be, the meaning here may not be clear at this point. All right, let's move along. Things fall apart as things usually do. We'll start with the Black Death and the rise of the bankers, and then mercantilism as replacing the medieval economic system, and finally the Reformation. All right, the Black Death, it hit England 1348 to 1351. Well, it killed 50% of the population, somewhere between 30 and 50% of the population. We're not talking COVID here. This created this labor scarcity, which drove up wages. The rich were getting squeezed. And money, not service, became the social nexus. So remember, before this, so there was kind of a set of mutual obligations between the lord and the tenants. But now money became the social nexus. This disrupted all social and economic relations. Then you had the rise of the bankers. This starts in 15th century in northern Italy with people like the Medici, um, in in Italy, the Fuggers, and yes, that's how you pronounce it, in Austria, and the Rothschilds. Now, the Rothschilds, by the way, were late comers, but the Rothschilds, unlike the Medicis, the Sforzis, and the rest of and the Fuggers were Catholic. The Rothschilds were Jewish, and it is the Rothschilds that lead to this myth of the Jewish banker. The actually banking was mostly Christian, and in modern times it was mostly Episcopalian, in fact. So finance and usury came to displace production as the key function. Craftsmen lost their independence, farmers lost their land. Here we see the roots of capitalism. Now, this is originally called mercantilism, rose in the 14th to the 18th centuries. Under mercantilism, the purpose of an economy is not to provide for the polis, is not to provide for society. It's simply a matter of acquiring more and more wealth, especially in the form of gold. This requires that there must always be a positive balance of trade. Well, but that's impossible. I mean, if one side has a positive balance, the other side must have a negative balance. So, in other words, the whole system was agonistic. It leads to constant warfare and to colonialism. So the economy is only about getting more gold. It has no higher purpose. Therefore, justice is no longer an issue. Then came the Reformation, starting in 1517 with Martin Luther nailing his theses, his 95 theses on the cathedral door. This shatters the religious unity of Europe. All right, and it leads to a whole bunch of things. Henry VIII and the seizure of monastic and guild lands. Now, this amounted to 1/3 of the land in England. This creates a new class. Why? Because the king didn't get to keep the land. He had too many debts, and it was sold off quickly, usually for pennies on the dollar or pennies on the pound. And you created this new class of landowners who came to dominate English politics, cultural, and social life. And at the same time, the church ceases to be an economic force. Remember, with 1/3 of the land, the church was very, very powerful economically. And this, of course, leads to a whole century of warfare. All right, then comes the Enlightenment. In the 17th century, we're going to talk about the 17th century. We're going to talk about Isaac Newton. Now, why are we going to talk about an astronomer in regards to economics? Well, stay tuned. We'll talk about the rise of naturalism and the effects here on religion and morality. Right, the 17th century. This was the era of the wars of religion and the rise of absolutism. Think of Hobbes' Leviathan. It's a time of economic, cultural, and religious chaos. And there's no authority that can resolve these disputes. Although into this environment comes Isaac Newton, 1643 to 1727. Now, what people forget about Newton is that he was not an astronomer. He was an alchemist. The fundamental teaching of alchemy was that there were no stable substances. One thing could be, with the right technique, be transmuted into another thing. And hence, lead could be changed into gold. However, Newton when he applied his principles to the stars, found that he could reduce everything to two simple laws. All these complex motions of the stars could be reduced to two simple laws: inertia and gravity. And this explains, this next explains why only an alchemist could do it. Because these laws of inertia and gravity were occult, without explanation. So as Newton put it in his text, hypothesis non fingo. I offer no hypothesis. You see, in alchemy, everything resolved to occult forces that themselves had no explanation. Now, other astronomers had come across these ideas of inertia and gravity, but they did not advance them because they could offer no explanation for them. Okay, it just seemed to be the way things work. For Newton, that wasn't an issue. Everything was occult anyway. So the fact that it had no explanation didn't prevent him from publishing. So, the Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, 1687. Everything now could be explained by mathematics and mechanics. And you got this idea of unaided reason alone as the explanation of everything. This was new. This is naturalism. So, the poet Alexander Pope would say, "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." Science in the Newtonian system is mechanical rather than organic. The older models of science were organic models. This was a purely mechanical model. So God becomes the great watchmaker with no further involvement. This is the idea of deism. God creates the world like it's a great big watch. He winds it up, then he steps back, and it runs all by itself. So nature, without God, and certainly without the church, could answer all questions if we just looked at it in the right way. So naturalism replaces natural law. And just as Newton had resolved the complex motions of the stars to a few natural laws, it set off this hunt for simple laws for markets and for politics. What did this mean for religion and morality? Well, the realm of the religious shrinks down to the personal and the subjective. So it's no longer a social reality. Then you got John Locke, who tolerates religion. And what does toleration mean for Locke? Well, it just means that religion is no longer important. You could tolerate it because it's just a private matter. It no longer has social and political implications. Note, Locke excludes two groups from toleration: Catholics and Muslims. Why? Because these are two religions that could never reject their own social and political claims. Hence, they could not be tolerated. So morals became a utilitarian calculation of pleasure and pain, or a means to get what you want, sympathy. The virtues, and especially justice, are irrelevant. Let's see how this developed. And we'll look at Bernard de Mandeville, Adam Smith, Thomas Malthus, and David Ricardo. Bernard de Mandeville. This is where the real change comes. 1670 to 1733. And it is de Mandeville's belief that only greed can bring prosperity. And he sets this forth in a book called The Fable of the Bees. And you only have to know what it means by looking at the subtitle: Private Vices, Public Benefits. Okay? Vice was now a benefit. Let's see what he meant. He used the beehive as the model. So, in this hive, in his theoretical beehive, every profession is corrupt. Okay. Lawyers loot the estates of their climates. Doctors sell quack cures. Ministers of state take bribes. The poor are oppressed, and only the poor suffer from prison and the death penalty. So he says, thus every part was full of vice, yet the whole mass a paradise. Vice makes it a paradise. Well, in the hive, the people complain about the viciousness of their rulers, and so the state becomes virtuous, and when it becomes virtuous, the hive collapses. So vice is the foundation of economic order, and virtue is the enemy of economic order. You see what a tremendous change from Aristotle and Aquinas this is. All right, so virtue is either just a cover for power, or else it's a way to get stupid people to obey the state. Actual virtue would wreck the economy. Vice was seen as a theophany, a working out of God's plan. Now, it is my opinion that all of modern economics is really just a commentary on Mandeville. And this is true, certainly true with Smith. It's true of Ricardo. It's true of Nassau Sr. These are figures we will look at. It's true of Ludwig von Mises. It's true of Milton Friedman. It's even true of Karl Marx. All right, the next figure we'll look at is Adam Smith, probably the most misunderstood of the modern philosophers. 1723 to 1790, labor and the invisible hand. And in this we'll look at das Adam Smith Problem. We'll look at the division of labor, and we'll look at the labor theory of value. And we'll look at self-interest and the invisible hand, and the two theories in conflict. All right, das Adam Smith Problem. Now it's called that because it's first noted by German commentators. Now, unfortunately, I do not speak German, so I cannot translate that for you. But what is das Adam Smith Problem? Well, remember, Adam Smith is a professor of moral theology. That is, he has my job at the University of Edinburgh. And he becomes famous with his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. So morality in this book is merely a social convention that's based on sympathy. We've looked at that before. Okay. But in The Wealth of Nations, justice is used 100 times. And he seems to mean a lot more than just a social convention. He puts justice at the heart of the system. So he makes the liberal reward of labor the key to prosperity. So this is a class conflict view of economics. But, he says, prices are set by the invisible hand. This is the social harmony view of the economy. All right, so he ends up with two theories that are in conflict with each other. All right, the division of labor. And of course, he used the famous pin factory example. You know, there's 17 steps involved in making pins. They each divided into workstations, and everybody does one little task. According to Smith, this increases skills, reduces setup times, and leads to innovation. But that was in the first edition. In the second edition, he changed his mind completely. And he said, under the division of labor, the worker generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. Well, what's he talking about? Well, in our work, we always confront problems. And we have to think about how we're going to solve these problems. Well, that's not true on the assembly line. You turn one bolt as it comes down the line. That's all you do. Therefore, you never solve any problems. Okay? You never have to think. The problem was, Smith confused the division of professions with the division of tasks. Obviously, we benefit, we don't want our lawyer to do surgery on us, nor do we want our doctor to handle questions of will and corporate law. There's a division, a useful division of professions, but it's not the same as an assembly line, obviously. Well, Smith continues the medieval tradition with the labor theory of value. Labor, he said, was the only standard of value by which you could compare one period with another. So think about this. How many Roman denarius are equal to an English pound? Well, it's kind of hard to ask that question. The question you can answer is, how many hours of work did it take a Roman peasant to earn a loaf of bread? And you could compare that with how many hours of work it took a factory worker to earn a loaf of bread. So labor is the only cost. All other costs are reducible to labor. So the cost of raw materials is really just the cost of labor of getting them out of the ground. The cost of machinery is just the cost of the labor that created that machinery. So labor formed the natural price of any commodity. So when he uses the example of deer and beaver, so suppose the rate of exchange between, suppose a hunter can catch 1 deer or 2 beaver in a day, then the natural rate of exchange between deer and beaver would be 1 deer was equal to 2 beavers. If that price changed in any way, if that ratio changed, if you could get 3 beaver for 1 deer, then people would switch from hunting beaver to hunting deer. And if it moved the other direction, they would switch from hunting deer to hunting beaver, and eventually you see it would all work out. All right. Now, it's important to note that his labor theory applies only to elastic, reproducible commodities. Doesn't apply to things like rare wines, jewelry, art, any of those kinds of things. And it applies only in free market situations. So it doesn't apply to monopolies or to things like that. This is very, very close to scholastic theory. And it very closely relates work to consumption. But what he's best known for is something he mentions twice, self-interest and the invisible hand. Trade, he said, arises from mutual advantage, not from love or charity. So, but in talking about self-interest, he tried to distinguish self-interest from special interests that seek monopoly prices. Prices, he said, are properly set by the higgling of the market. And this is the invisible hand. The market, the bargaining in the market will make things come out right. However, there's a problem here. If everybody is just self-interested, why wouldn't they seek special privileges? There's no limit in Adam Smith's system. It really is kind of a market mysticism. The invisible hand will make things work out if people act in their self-interest but don't seek special privileges. Well, that really, when you boil that out, that's really not much of a theory. It's not a very strong anthropology on which you can build a theory. So, what Smith ends up with is two theories that are in conflict with each other. The labor theory of value is a theory of distributive justice, but self-interest is a theory of commutative justice. He never unifies them into one theory. So he fails to find the Newtonian. That's what he was looking for, this self-regulating principle. Now, the 19th century would see a split between utilitarians and labor theorists. And the thing is, they all think they're just reading Adam Smith. And they are. So, Smith becomes an iconic figure for both capitalists and communists. All right, let's move on to Thomas Malthus, 1766 to 1834, and the iron law of wages. Now you can see in this a real continuation of the ideas of de Mandeville. We'll talk about the law of population and predators versus cultivators. Malthus holds the idea that population expands faster than food supply. So this means as wages go up, the population increases. People have more children. This increases the labor force, which drives wages down until they reach starvation rates, which reduces population. Now he says, attempts to relieve poverty are contrary to natural law. Note here the use of the term natural law, and he means something entirely different than was meant during the Middle Ages. Now he means this sort of natural operation of nature. Poverty, for Malthus, who by the way is a preacher, is God's way of disciplining the poor, of teaching them a lesson. Okay? Apparently God lacks any means to discipline the rich. Now this is a persistent theory, even though it's falsified in every generation. In fact, it was falsified even in Malthus's time. In the first edition of his book, he says that the falling population of England is absolute proof of this theory. When it was pointed out that the population of England was not falling, but in fact growing rapidly, the second edition of his book said, the rapidly rising population of England is absolute proof of this theory. Okay, what's wrong with the theory? Well, he didn't understand the difference between predators and cultivators. So look at the predator-prey model and the cultivator model. Let's look at chicken hawks. Let's say chicken hawks prey on chickens. I don't know anything about chicken hawks. I don't know what they actually prey on, but let's say they prey on chickens. So as the population of hawks increases, the population of chickens is going to decrease. The decreasing population of chickens leads to hawk starvation. Hawk starvation leads to an increase in the population of chickens, etc. So they just kind of chase each other around, in a big circle, a never-ending circle. All right, that's one model. The other model is the cultivator model. Man eats chickens. Therefore, he cultivates chickens. And because he cultivates chickens, there are more chickens than would ever exist in nature, not less. And food supply expands with population, not decreases. Well, as I say, Malthus's theory is disproved in every generation, yet it remains persistent. It has kind of a nice logic to it, rising population, limited Earth, it's a blah, blah, blah. it seems to be a perennial error um, that we can't seem to rid ourselves of. All right, let's go to David Ricardo, though. Now, he's in the next generation after Smith, 1772 to 1823. Land rent and subsistence as the limits on profit. Ricardo is a close reader of Adam Smith, but he starts in a different place. Smith starts from the standpoint of labor. Ricardo makes his fortune in the stock market. He's a trader. And so his interest is, how can we make more money in the market? All right. So he deals with two things, the law of rents and comparative advantage. The law of rents, now he wants to remove a limit on profit. The greatest limit on profits is ground rent. What is ground rent? Ground rent is equal to the difference between the lowest parcel in use and the particular parcel you're looking at. We'll go into this in much greater detail next week, but suppose the lowest parcel of use for which you can charge rent gets a rent of whatever, 1 bushel of wheat. But this parcel that you're looking at produces more than this lowest parcel. Well, the landlord will take everything over the value of that lowest parcel. This limits the returns to both capital and labor. The lion's share goes to the landlord. Never mind about the mechanics now, but that's the problem that he's dealing with. So rent equalizes the return to capital and labor for all land, and it reduces all labor to subsistence. Rent adds nothing to production but claims the lion's share. Well, Ricardo's solution is that only rent should be taxed. There should be no taxes on capital, no taxes on labor, only ground rent. Not the rent of capital items like buildings and machinery, whatever. Only ground rent should be taxed. He's also known for the theory of comparative advantage. All right, it starts here. He talks about surplus values. Surplus values are all the profits over subsistence, all the values over subsistence. And for Ricardo, this should be profit. This should go to the investor. Now, think about it. If you could lower the cost of grain, you could lower wages because the cost of subsistence would be lower. Well, English grain was more expensive than continental grain, and it was protected by tariffs. So the idea here is that if you could remove the tariffs and import, French and German grain, you could lower the cost of bread and thereby lower wages and increase profits. So his idea was that a country can profit by concentrating on what it does best. So the English wheat is more expensive, then they should stop growing wheat and grow something else and buy all the wheat from the Germans. It's a highly contingent theory that he's thinking that capital is immobile. You can't move plant and equipment around very easily. It only applies when there's full employment of all resources in both trading partners and that there's balanced trade. So what you have is a highly abstract theory with no actual applications. All right. This leads to the age of laissez-faire, the Industrial Revolution, the triumph of the Liberal Party, the gold standard, and the Irish potato famine. Think about it. The Industrial Revolution, well, it's actually misnamed somewhat. There had been continual technical progress since about the 10th or 11th century, but it stopped dead during the 17th century because of the wars of religion. But it picked up then in the 18th century, and it was fueled by cheap energy. Most factories prior to this had been run simply on water power, mills. But then we got sources of cheap energy, first coal and later oil, that replaced water power. This brought tremendous productive power, but it came with high investment costs. So it involved a central contradiction. All right? You needed low wages to make this pay, but you needed high wages to consume all that was being produced. So the system was constantly unstable. So what should be done about that? Well, the Liberal Party takes control. The Liberals had the answer. So in 1832, the Liberals, and here think that the meaning of the words have changed. Think libertarian. The Libertarians win control of Parliament. And they believed that the unfettered free market would solve the wage problem. Laissez-faire became state policy, which is kind of ironic when you think about it. And there would be free trade. Well, actually, there wasn't. The Liberals weren't able to get free trade passed until 1860 because while there was a lot of talk about free trade, they didn't actually want it. And it involved another thing. Labor had to be disciplined. Labor didn't want to work 12 hours a day in these factory conditions. So the very generous welfare system of England, called the Speenham system, was ended. And the workhouse was established. Basically, the workhouse criminalized poverty. You had the rise of colonialism. Why? As a source of cheap raw materials and cheap labor. Well, the Liberals believed that they had realized the Newtonian dream, a self-regulating mechanism. Well, this self-regulating economy needed a self-regulating money supply, and so they came up with the gold standard. 1821 to 1914 in England and 1873 to 1933 in the United States. But this was a pure invention. Gold had never been a standard. It had been one among many systems of money that existed at the same time. Most people would never actually see a gold coin, much less own one throughout their lives. Problem with gold is that it was a rigid money supply that could not keep up with a growing economy. Think of it, you had a fixed money supply, but you had rising, goods and services. So that could only lead to deflation, and deflation is disastrous for business. So look at this chart. So look at here. This is the period of the gold standard. All right. These greens are period of inflation, reds period of deflation. During the period of gold standard, you had this wild alteration between high inflation, higher than anything that's been seen since, and disastrous deflation. So it really didn't have any kind of stability until they got off the gold standard. All right. So it alternated high inflation with low deflation, and worse than high inflation, worse than low deflation is their alteration. Okay. Think about it. You're a shopkeeper, You take out a loan during an inflationary period to finance the stock in your store because you expect a certain price for it. Then deflation hits. You can't sell it for that price anymore. Okay, and the all of a sudden you're left with debts you cannot cover. Well, I want to talk here in this regard about the Irish potato famine. Now, a potato blight struck the world in 1845. It struck the whole world, not just Ireland. Only in Ireland did it cause a famine. And most peculiarly, this famine only affected Catholics. Can you imagine that? What kind of a famine is religiously selective? Can you imagine, COVID that only affects Lutherans? What was going on here? Well, the British government treated the famine as a God-given opportunity to prove that the free market would work. Let me go back to the question of why it only happened among Catholics. Well, Catholics had been dispossessed of their land, and by law they could only lease land worth a certain amount, own land worth a certain amount of money. These tended to be sandy patches of land that were best for growing potatoes. So potatoes became the staple of the Irish Catholics. Right? But not for the rest of the population, just for the Catholics. So when the potato crop failed, that was the food supply for Catholics. Now, little or no aid was given. Why? Because giving stuff away is an interference with free markets. You see? And in fact, people shipped in supplies. It's like any other famine. People tried to help from other countries, tried to help. They shipped in food to Ireland. The British government refused to let those supplies land. And when they did land, they were taken into government warehouses and had to be sold like any other food. Not only that, food was shipped out of Ireland. Ireland was growing enough food to feed itself. But because of free trade, it went where the money was, which wasn't in Ireland, it was in England. 1 million people died of starvation, and 1 million immigrated. This out of a population of 8 million. Think about that. Project that into our own situation. Think about 1/4 of the population dying or immigrating. Well, that's what happened. And this played a big part in the revolutions of 1848. All right. Let's pause right here. Okay, we'll go into the great thinkers. We'll start with the great thinkers of the age of laissez-faire with our next lecture. But let's hold that. And let me suggest, let me turn this off. Let's think about this and think about some fundamental questions here. Okay. What do you think are the implications of the shift from an economy based in virtue to an economy based in vice? What are the implications for the foundation of economic order? But also, how does this affect politics and social relations? And really, can we really build a functioning society on this basis? All right, think about these questions, and whatever questions you have, write them down, put them on the discussion board, but bring them into our study sessions, and let's discuss them. All right. Um, well, I bid you good day, and we will we'll talk about this in our groups. Goodbye.